Sound like somebody's fan is in the computer system or something. Somebody sitting in front
Oh, that might be me.
of because it's still hearing it.
Yeah, so far so good.
It ain't you because I still heard it when you went on mute.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Y'all
Okay,
don't
here,
hear
let
that?
me see. So Kevin, I'm gonna ask you to, well, okay, folks, there we go. So thank you so much. As folks join in, I see we have about 55 folks already in. Thank you so much for joining us. As people get admitted, please note that there will be a 15-minute Q&A at the end of this discussion. So please, we highly encourage you to type in your questions in the Q&A box below. And then the panelists will make sure that they get to the question at the end of the discussion. By way of introduction, my name is Johnny Perez. I work as the Director of U.S. Prison Programs for the National Religious Campaign Against Torture, where I work with faith leaders and people like myself who has been impacted by the criminal legal system across 11 states, actually, to end the torture of solitary confinement. I'm also happy to have come full circle as a former staff member of the Urban Justice Center's Mental Health Project. They gave me my first shot when I first came home. And then today now, I sit as one of the newest members of the UJC's Board of Directors, so very proud to be able to introduce this conversation. So I wanted to take a moment to kind of frame this conversation, share why it is important and even critical that as we continue to make fundamental changes in society as it relates to systemic oppression, state-sponsored violence, and the elimination of racial disparities, that we do so with from every single crevice of our shared society, but especially in those places that are the darkest. And one thing that I've learned from doing this work is that when we see little transparency, we also see little to no accountability. So right now we're in this moment where we have been and even continue to be outraged by the death of countless women, men, and children of color at the hands of those who we pay to protect us. But sadly, the truth is that by the time we get motivated enough to want to do something, someone already lost their life. A mother, a son, a father, a daughter, a grandchild or grandfather. And if 2020 taught us anything, is that recording sometimes is just not enough. And I would argue that Mr. Floyd, God rest his soul, did not want another camera in his face, and he actually needed action. So he needed someone to care enough about him, to see enough of themselves in him to actually physically intervene. And in very much way that our criminal legal system has responded to public health issues like homelessness, mental health, poverty, with role in probation. We also now see during this public health crisis that is COVID-19, and we're also seeing the same type of punitive responses from correctional departments across the country. We see these correctional departments using solitary confinement as a containment strategy for COVID-19, resulting in what Unlock the Box and groups like Solitary Watch have reported an increase in 500% use of solitary confinement over the last 90 days. So I want to mention that what on the surface seems to be a conversation about police brutality or you know, in many spaces, or a conversation about police and funding, understand that this is just fruit from a poisonous tree, that tree being racism and the systemic oppression of Black and brown people who continue to carry the brunt of society's decisions long before this current pandemic. So with framing that, I want to take a step back, and I want to introduce the moderator for this conversation, someone who I've actually had the pleasure of working with over the years, Eileen Rivers, who is on USA Today's editorial board and is the founder and editor of USA Today's online vertical in Policing the USA, which I've also had the pleasure of writing, having public commentary on. Before coming to USA Today, she was an editor and reporter at the Washington Post. You know, Eileen also spent 4 years in the Army as an Arabic linguist and authored Beyond the Call, 3 women on the front lines in Afghanistan, and I really need to read that. So with that being said, I'm gonna pass it over to you, Eileen. Thank you so much, and I really look forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johnny. I look forward to it too. And thank you for that plug for my book. That's awesome. So as Johnny said, I'm an editor at USA Today. I'm on the editorial board there, and I'll be hosting the conversation today. I'm really looking forward to digging into all these topics. So let me start by introducing the panelists. I'm going to start with Kevin Creary. He has spent more than 20 years in and out of the justice system. He was recently released from Rikers in April. He's originally from Flatbush, New York. Ash Prashar is also on the panel today. He is a justice reform campaigner He sits on the board of the Exodus Transitional Community. Dr. Victoria Phillips, you'll hear us refer to her as Ms. V. She is a criminal justice reformer, a social justice activist, and also a mental health professional. Misael Sildor is the program associate at the Independent Commission on New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform, and she's also a recent graduate of Oberlin College. So, Kevin, I'm going to kick this conversation off by coming to you. You, as I said in the introduction, were in Rikers until April. From what I understand, you were released mainly because of your age. You're 59 years old. As Johnny said in his introduction, there's a lot of stuff going on in prisons today with COVID. People are being put on lockdown. It seems like there's this big struggle to figure out how exactly we deal with COVID and incarceration in prisoners and keeping them safe, but also allowing them some element of normalcy, if you can say that, within the incarceration system. So Kevin, can you tell us what your recent experience has been like at Rikers? What were you seeing? How were inmates being treated? What was your experience there, especially as it relates to COVID? Kevin, I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, my stay on Rikers was like for about a month because I was initially detained at the Vernon C. Bain Correctional Complex, which is the boat that is moored out in the East River over in the Bronx. So I was overloaded from that facility to Rikers Island to a detention facility called North Infirmary Command. It's sort of like a quote unquote hospital setting type of facility. They send people there that have different type of injuries or illnesses. So when I was overloaded from Vernon C. Bain, they sent me to NIC. And it was in a dorm setting. We had about 25 beds, 30 beds in the dorm. And on each floor, you had a nurse's station on each floor. So if you had any medical concerns to address, it was simply just signing up for sick call, and the officers would call you in the morning to just go down the corridor to the sick call office. Mm-hmm. So when I got there about the middle of March, from what I understand, several people were just sent there from different facilities on Rikers Island who fit the criteria, who could be susceptible to the COVID-19 virus. And we had all just arrived there within inside a week or so within inside one another. So I was there with about maybe 15 people when I arrived. And basically when I got there, it was just being ran like regular jail. They didn't have any procedures situated at that time. They were just playing it by ear as they went along. So basically, like the second day when I was there, I was given a test to see if I was positive or negative for the virus. It took about 2 weeks for the test to come back, about a week and a half, almost 2 weeks. But when it arrived, fortunately, I was negative. But there were other individuals there who had tested positive. When those people's tests came back positive, they were sent out from that facility to another facility on Rikers Island. I don't know which facility they were sent to. I was heard they were sent to C-76, which was recently closed down several months earlier. That's the sentence facility for city sentence inmates. But from what I understand, they had shut it down to accommodate those individuals who had came down positive with the virus. And those individuals were supposed to stay for 14 days. But unfortunately, it didn't work out that way. Some individuals that were sent there came back a little bit sooner than the 14-day quarantine period. And some of those folks still showed symptoms of having the virus in some form of fashion, coughing, not feeling well in particular. So those of us that were there who tested negative, we were coming up with questions to correction staff on, this person isn't well. It doesn't look like that person is over their symptoms. Why are they back?
Right. So there was no real separation between people who were showing symptoms and people who, like you, had tested negative for this virus.
Right. So our questions to correction staff and even to the medical staff, why are these persons back in our presence? Because it appears that you would be putting us at risk, those of us who were still negative, you
Right.
would be putting us at risk. And I would assume you would be putting those people that tested positive at risk again, because from
Mm-hmm. So one more question for you before I kick it to Ash, who can kind of, give a broader context for all this. But on the outside, we're constantly hearing about, social distancing. Clearly, you've made it, clear that that's not possible in a place like Rikers. We're also hearing about using hand sanitation, like sanitizing your hands, washing your hands, using a mask. I'm just wondering how possible it was for you guys to get that kind of equipment on the inside. Were you given hand sanitizer? Were you given masks? And did you see the guards and other staff there wearing those things as well?
Well, masks didn't come into play until like about a month later, into April. When I initially was there, the middle of March, there were no masks, there was no hand sanitizer, there definitely was no social distancing, because the beds in the detention facilities on Rikers Island are screwed into the floor. So you cannot move the beds. You can't even move the tables where you sit down and eat your meals at, because those tables and seats as well are screwed into the floor. So there's no way to social distance as far as the beds are concerned, not unless you put a person in a bed and maybe 2 beds over would be empty.
Right.
So that was a concern in itself. Our major concern was that corrections was not supplying us with the hand sanitizer or with the sanitizing products to keep our dorm and bathroom and shower areas, properly sanitized. We were just given the regular old stuff that they usually give us to clean up with.
Okay.
And that lasted, like I said, like throughout the month of March into almost about a week or two before I left. Because right around that time, that's when they started distributing the mask. We still didn't receive any latex gloves, but they came around to giving us the mask.
So Ash, let me kick it to you. Let's put this in, broader context. Again, as Johnny said in his intro, and as Kevin definitely talked about when he was recounting his experiences, it's hard to social distance in a prison. They're not getting the PPE. They're also not getting hand sanitizer. Everybody's talking about what's happening on the outside. How concerned should the public be, should people who are watching this be, about what's happening in prisons right now?
Yeah, I mean, the public should be concerned. I mean, if you consider that, and I want to take one step back quickly. Everyone, obviously, we've been talking about the Black Lives Matter movement. As Johnny pointed out, we're talking about, how George Floyd got executed on video. But also, I think people's attention to the injustices of our justice system started with COVID-19. Like stuff that we were seeing in the papers and in our media about how people in prison were being treated, and how, to your point, the advice we were getting out here and how they were kept inside those cells was completely different. It's the civil rights issue of our time, and it's terrifying to see the onset of COVID-19 and what it's actually doing. And the only good thing is it's shined a light on the travesty of our prison system. it's often overcrowded. They have terrible access to healthcare. You know, they also have lots of pre-existing conditions people do in prison. And this disease, when it's, you know, when you've got more, when you're more confined, spreads even quicker. And we're seeing the biggest clusters in America. The 5 biggest clusters right now are in prisons. They are in, I think there's one in California, which actually some people consider to be one of the trigger points for their second wave of virus, the second wave of COVID-19 outbreak in California. Because even during this pandemic, we were transporting prisoners across this country. Prisoners that, while, as Kevin mentioned, some people weren't getting tested but showing symptoms, some people were. But people were moving prisons, and what that leads to is just more infections in confined environments. And then you tap in the fact that guards are probably getting it at the same time. And then they go back to their communities. The spread will never be contained because of this issue. I mean, our leaders have basically put thousands of people's lives at risk by trapping them in unsafe and unsanitary conditions. And unfortunately, as we all know, it infects in clusters. Incarceration is having a devastating impact on people's personal health. And under normal circumstances, we in America don't always have the best access to healthcare because it's based through our employment. But prisoners, and I know this from a lot of stuff that's come out of New York State, there is no ventilators in prisons. There are none of the resources that we have, like in our city in New York, to actually take care of you if you actually contract the virus in the same degree as most people out here would have it. And our leaders, again, have done nothing. Yes, we've had some small levels of release, but this is an opportunity for them to really look at reimagining what this is. It's shown how we have never been judicious about how many people we put in prison. We've never cared about their conditions. And this is shining a light that's overdue. And putting people in solitary is not the answer. All you're going to do is create other health problems that I know the rest of the panel have been working on all their careers in mental health and everything like that. But you are causing more damage and more other healthcare issues for those individuals as we trap them in environments with no end in sight. Because as we know, living out here in America, we don't know when this pandemic is going to be over. And we are complaining about being stuck in apartments and houses. These people are stuck in a cell 24 hours a day with no access to the yard. I think Kevin mentioned to me earlier, like, there's no access to the yards, no access to the general population room, and there's no access to even laundry. So they're stuck in this one room for that amount of time. And that is also torment and torture in a way. So the long-term implications of COVID-19 on people who are incarcerated, we still don't know what that's going to look like.
So let me push back, and I'll open this question out to the entire panel. But Ash, I want to piggyback on something you just said, which is that solitary confinement is not the answer, right? So we're constantly telling prison officials, separate inmates who are sick. One of their solutions is solitary confinement. If that's not the answer, and I'll open this up to everybody, then what is the answer? I think a lot of people don't understand that the prison population on some level is potentially more vulnerable to this than the general population. So if solitary isn't the answer, what is?
Well, 40% of people incarcerated are not a public safety concern, according to the Brennan Report of 2016. So we should be releasing those 40% immediately. They don't pose any public safety risk. There are people who are elderly, who've been in prison for a long time, but also there are people who shouldn't be in jail because they couldn't afford bail. So we're talking about people in prisons and jails who aren't even convicted or have no guilt yet, who are now being sentenced to a death sentence without trial. So yes, we could remove, look, I'm a prison abolitionist, but while the prison system exists, we could remove so many people from it to save lives.
So if COVID is potentially spreading in prison at a more rapid rate, potentially, than it is in general population, and then we turn to the public and say, let's release people, I can imagine a lot of members of the public saying, well, wait a minute, you're not in my backyard, the kind of NIMBY effect, right? You're not going to release people where I am because A, I'm concerned that they're former inmates. Let's face it, there are a lot of people who don't believe that a lot of former inmates are not threats to their community. And then on top of that, there's the COVID problem. Mm-hmm. So where is it working? Ms. V, I see that you're trying to chime in. How can this work?
Because you said, we could all jump in. So I feel like
absolutely
right here.
Yeah.
I think that first of all, it's important when we talk about criminal justice reform, that we focus as far as the little bit that we overlook, like language, right? So they're not inmates, they're incarcerated individuals or detainees at best. And that's something that I try to enforce, even DOC professionals, to start getting in their brain, because it takes like how many days? 21 days to make or break a habit, right? So if you use the language consistently, you'll start to humanize people that you have dehumanized in many different ways. And then for the community, we can't look at them as incarcerated people returning back to our society. We have to look at them as community members, which they are when they left our society, while they were being detained in our society. And when they return back to our communities, they are still members and residents of our communities. And that is how we're supposed to welcome them. And one thing people need to realize, even when we talk on the local level, because Rikers is not a prison, Rikers is a jail, and 85% of the people that are detained there are still waiting their supposed fair day in court. Let's be clear about that. And so they are directly our community members who we are supposed to make sure have direct access to the things that they would have on any other day if they were physically in the community. And when we start appreciating people in that sense and looking at people in that sense, then we can open our mindset up to the idea of not allowing tragedy behind the walls because it's not being filmed, like on George Floyd's unfortunate death, to really fester in our minds and not accept it. And I think that's part of the problem, because so often the brutality, the horrendous actions that occur are not caught on film. So it's unimaginable. But we have to understand, many people who have been incarcerated come back, they are not seen, they're never believed, but their truth has to be allowed to be pushed to power. So thank you, Kevin, for coming on here today. And thank you for disclosing everything that you have disclosed so far about you and your story directly, because this is how we make change. This is how we start accepting people back. And I don't mean to go on for a rant, but I think it's important that we accept people as our community.
So how do we ensure that works? We know that recidivism rates are high already. So when we're talking about releasing people from incarceration under normal circumstances, when employment is, at a very attainable level. Right now we have, businesses that are closed down because of COVID. We have people who don't have a history of incarceration struggling to get employment. How do we release people now and ensure that they're being released into something that works for them?
I mean, first, I just want to carry on what Miss B says a little bit on that, and it kind of gets to your answer. If the pandemic has taught us anything, we're in this together, right? Trying to survive this. And if we acknowledge that all people are worthy of care, and that often these mistakes that they're either accused for or locked up for come from a lack of relationship or housing or food or unmet needs, we change our whole mindset about them being released. And then what you need to do, to your point about what they would come out to, we have a lot of abandoned hotels in this city right now. There's a lot of, you said there's a lot of businesses not going out of business. There's a lot of housing out here in New York that could be, if our city or our governor, or in any state, frankly, wanted to use as housing temporarily, they could. Yes, employment is an issue right now, but there are jobs. I don't believe if we don't try hard enough, I think if we tried hard enough, we could find employment. But there are things like food and housing that we have in abundance. We've just not made it available to everyone in our society. And this is an opportunity to think about how we reimagine all of society at the same time.
Right, and I'd also like to add, like, similar to what Ash has been saying, and back to your earlier question about, people's concerns about decarceration, I think, as Ash has been saying, well, like this pandemic is a moment for reevaluation for everybody, for how our systems work. And when you're thinking about like people who are incarcerated, like even if you were a person that had concerns about, people who've been charged with violent crimes, there are all these people there are 4,000 people in New York State prison right now who are serving sentences just for a technical parole violation. And if you're not familiar with the system of parole, like when you're released, you have conditions of your release that have nothing to do with crime. They're like administrative releases, like making curfew or reporting to an officer for it in every certain period or something like that, or not what they call fraternizing with people who have been charged with a felony, and things like that that become tripwires that have you end up being reincarcerated again. So there are 4,000 people in state prison right now who, even during this pandemic, when decarceration would be the best answer to curbing the spread of COVID in prisons and jail, decarceration, like creating the space for people to socially distance, because there are all these people that don't need to be there for any sort of safety reason. Like there are 4,000 people in state prison right now who are serving sentences up to a year and over that just for missing curfew or things like that, or having a glass of wine because they're not allowed to drink, like things that none of us would ever be arrested for if we did not have those charges looming over us. So when you're and even today in Rikers, there are 180 people who are accused of a technical parole violation. Why are they there? Why are any of these people there? That makes no sense if we're trying to curb the pandemic spread in prisons and jails. It makes no sense if we're trying to uphold public safety, because they haven't done anything that would endanger any of us, right? So when you start thinking about like, why are people even in these systems? Like, why did we even put them there? And you start interrogating like who belongs there and who doesn't, because I also am a prison abolitionist. Like, there's so many ways that we have failed people long before they ever entered the justice system. Like Ash was saying, we have a budget that didn't reflect any values of reevaluation. Like, we're still spending 15 billion total in traditional law enforcement like the Department of Correction and NYPD, and we're not funding like housing, we're not funding affordable housing, we're not funding homeless outreach services, we're not funding things that would end food insecurity, we're not funding any of those things. We're funding traditional law enforcement systems that clearly have not worked and then wondering what's going on. So I think to people who may be watching this, who are, maybe have those kinds of ideologies and are concerned about safety and what maintains public safety, like this is also a great period for you to reevaluate why you have those ideologies and evaluate like how we have failed people as a society, and take this opportunity to get involved in fixing that.
So I've heard, oh, go ahead, Ms. V.
Yes, I just want to jump in on what Ms. Ayala was saying. When we speak about society and failing our community members, we have to think about the vulnerable populations in our community. That's our youth, they end up behind the walls. That's our elderly, they end up behind the walls. That's our disabled, they too end up behind the walls. And when we think about it like that, 52% of the population in New York City's Department of Corrections right now has had some form of contact with mental health services. That's 52%. That's more than half of their population that probably should not be there and should have been referred to some other form of city or government agency for assistance in their matter, whether it's mental health, whether it's physical health, whether it's lack of housing, educational, like vocational training, all of these things that would assist them from getting out that system. People who have mental health diagnoses are cycled through 3 systems in our city. It's the shelter system, the hospital system, and the correctional system. So when we talk about failing as a society, and when we talk about caring for those, we have to really hold ourselves accountable, because we don't care for our elderly if they end up sick behind correctional walls, not be having access to medical care. We don't care for our youth if we push them aside in our communities. We allow the police to come in and abuse them, kidnap them off the street. And then when we get a call from them, it's like, well, you must have did something. I'm gonna teach you a lesson. And then they pick up additional charges while behind the walls. We don't care for those with mental health diagnoses if we can't understand that they need compassion and love and maybe some medical attention while they're decompensating, rather than throwing them into a system that's going to abuse them and give them extra tickets and penalize them when they're crying out for care. So we don't care. And as a society, we need to start learning how to hold ourselves accountable, because the vulnerable population need us.
So I've heard, I heard Ash use this term, and I also heard Ms. Ayala use this term, abolish the prison system, abolish the incarceration system. We're living in an era now where that word holds a particular trigger, right? Because people are talking about abolishing police departments around the country. And I think when people hear that word, they're not exactly sure what it means. So put that in context. What does it mean to abolish the prison system and the incarceration system? And what would replace it? I think people are worried about that as well. Either Ash or Misael, you can pick that question up.
Do you, Misael?
So I'm admittedly young and new to learning about all of this, but I think what people miss in if you're not familiar with the term or miss in these discussions is like people are thinking, if you defund the police, if you abolish police, if you abolish prison, there's no form of accountability for when someone causes harm. Mm-hmm. And I think from my knowledge of abolition, what abolition is saying is like, if prisons and police and jail could have stopped crime, we'd have no crime. We've had it for decades. We've had these systems for decades and they haven't worked. And in fact, like, especially you can see this in New York City, like when we've been on the trend of decarceration is when our crime levels have actually been lowered. So if prisons and jails and policing was all we needed to solve crime, then, we would have none of it. And that's not the case. So I think when people are missing these discussions, they're thinking like, if we defund the police, then they don't have the resources and access to protect us if like a violent crime or something like that were to happen, which is not the majority of what police do. That's about 4% of their time. But also, we need to really look at like what are the biggest factors of causing crime, especially violent crime, which is what most people are concerned of. And more like you can take lived experience alone should be enough knowledge of why this happens. But also like there have been studies for decades that have shown like economic insecurity, housing insecurity, food insecurity, lack of meaningful employment, lack of meaningful educational opportunities, lack of community support systems are all factors that lead people into becoming incarcerated. And it's very, everyone who would be like thinking that jail and prison and things are the answer have this idea that if you're someone who's in charge of the crime, you're some kind of like evil sadist that's against humanity. And really much more often than not, this is the product of a system of failure. So if we instead stop putting money, billions of dollars, like I mentioned before, New York City spends $15 billion on correctional agencies. If we stop taking money and putting money into systems that have not eliminated crime, right? They disappear people who cause crime or who have committed crime, but they don't eliminate crime. If we instead take that money and use it to address the things that we have seen cause crime, like the things I mentioned, that would be a way for us to repair systems of harm, to create accountability that doesn't further traumatize people, while also meeting the needs for our communities to prevent crime, especially violent crime, from happening. So I'll let Ash continue if he has more to add.
Yeah, I think it goes back to why did we build this system in the first place, right? So, the foundation of all of this is the 13th Amendment. And we have to look back at why this system from policing through to prisons has been built. It was built to enslave people. And if that's the foundation of it, it wasn't built to rehabilitate people or help people or even punish people, frankly. It was built to enslave people. And until that root is ripped out by abolishing this current system, we're never going to have a fair justice system, full stop. Everything Misael said was perfect. I mean, look, our leaders have invested again and again and again in the existing structures, from policing to the justice system, when they should really be divesting from those structures and investing in community action programs that are founded on empathy, which is crucial. That money could go into people. It could go into preventative social initiatives and help build strong and supportive communities for our young people, our old people, rather than building walls. We need to invest that money outside the prison walls to abolish prisons, because it would significantly reduce that so-called criminal population that they say needs to be punished. And I think the fundamental thing, I think Ms. V pointed out, like, we're not investing in homelessness. We're not investing in mental health. We are punishing poverty. we're not punishing crimes. That's what we're doing right now. Instead of looking for solves for that poverty, instead of actually investing in people.
So let me push back a little bit. This is again for everybody. I can hear, I deal a lot with the public and readers with what I do for USA Today. And trust me, you're preaching to the choir to some extent here. I'm on the opinion page. We publish columns all the time that say this very thing. And we constantly get pushback of, okay, sure, you can do you can build all the services you want to ensure that people have a good education, to ensure that people are not stuck in poverty and have opportunity. But there are still going to be people who commit crimes. No matter what, even if you do all of that, what about those people? How do we deal with that if we're abolishing these systems? How would you deal with somebody who actually commits a crime and maybe deserves punishment?
Well, call me utopian. I just think if everyone had an equal opportunity in life, there would be a lot less crime. And if someone asked me the other day, what does defunding the police look like? I was like, it's the difference between the Upper West Side and Harlem. The most police I've seen in the last 2 years I've lived in the Upper West Side are guarding a statue. What they've invested in the Upper West Side are schools, community centers, health programs, great doctors. And I'm not saying crime doesn't happen here, but I'm just saying that it's greatly reduced because fundamentally we've put money into, in this area, definitely white people. Now, we've not putting that same money into communities of color in any community in New York, or I would say across America, to that same level. And while that's the case, those people might push back, but they're not getting that. They've never let that community get that same level of investment that our governments and our institutions have done for them.
Kevin, I'm going to turn to you. You were in the system recently. When you hear Ash and Misael talk about services that could have helped people have opportunity, how do you think that applies to your situation? What do you think that would have done for you if you'd had those opportunities before you started, getting into trouble in life?
I think that's a very big issue, that needed to be addressed a long time ago, because just like we have preventive medicine now, we should have had preventive measures in place in the communities of color, and not only communities of color, but communities where you have low income people in place to help them achieve, those things that are just natural to have as a human being: food, shelter, and a job. The three basic things in life that people just want to have. I think if we would look at more preventive measures, we wouldn't have to have the need of all this mass incarceration. I think, like all the panelists have stated, Ash and Dr. V, is that all this money that's being applied to police departments and correctional is really money wasted. We have so many other areas here in America that we could address these issues by placing those of us who unfortunately come in and out of the system. There's a reason why, because there's no preventive measures in place in the communities to prevent certain things from happening. I could remember when I was younger, and that was a long time ago, you had community centers, you had the YMCA, and to a lesser extent, you had the Police Athletic League that were in the communities that prevented certain things from happening in the communities. You had better resources, but it seems as time has went on, those resources have been taken out of the community and been placed in policing and into mass incarceration. I mean, it's really a shame here in the richest country on the planet that we have more people per capita incarcerated than any other place on the planet. And that's outrageous. That's insane. There has to be a better way to address what's going on here in our country, and specifically in communities of color and low-income communities where we could do a better job. It seems like we disinvested out of people, like the panelists have been saying. We took money away from people and resources away from the community and placed it where we just want to just lock people up in mass for the most part, like one of the panelists mentioned, a very small part of the population are in there for anything violent. Most of it is nonviolent. And most of the time you're sitting up in detention facilities just waiting to be called to pass judgment to be sentenced on something so minor, where all of this could have been prevented by having the resources in the community to keep people, sustained, educational wise, vocational wise, health wise. Like Dr. V mentioned, for mental health, a large part of the population in jail who suffer from mental health crises, that they address it by locking people up, which is absurd. There's better way to address those situations, and I'm hopeful that because all the social justice protesting that's been going on because of George Floyd's unfortunate situation, this has been enlightening people a little bit more, and hopefully the people in power hopefully are taking some notice of this and maybe rethinking on what we're doing here in America and specifically in communities of color.
Ms. V, I saw that you were going to chime in before Kevin started speaking. We have a few questions from people who are watching. But Ms. V, I'll give you the last word before we go to those. Oh, you're on mute. You're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
I just want to touch because you asked a question about if you remove the police. So you look like you can't hear me. Can you hear me?
Well, you faded out a little bit, but you're back. Go ahead.
So I think it's very important. I was taught as an Army brat that you don't go out and come home while leaving any of your platoon behind. And so I've taken that mindset while trying to transform the criminal justice system or the criminal legal system with no justice. And to answer your question, communities can thrive by removing the police. Strong communities make police obsolete. And I truly believe that. And it's been shown by our elders. The Black Panthers, they created the breakfast system. Then our school system took it on. There's so many different ways that communities can protect themselves while still holding their community members accountable when they do wrong. But they don't have to allow someone outside who's not a part of the community, who do not understand the culture of the community, to come in and violate them and their human rights, and most of the time their civil rights as well. And so if we stick to that content, Ms. L and I, we are a part of the Justice for Women Task Force. That's a way of organizing to get different people that's coming home, housing, to, access to employment. So many different ways of different people that do different things in the community coming together underneath one task force. The Jails Action Coalition, we make sure what's going on in jail is brought to the forefront. There's so many different things that community members can create within their own community to help make change. But they have to be taught how to make that change. They have to be properly funded to be able to make that change. And they have to be reminded by uniting and sticking together is what will get us over this hump and what will create major change across the nation.
I love that. I have to remember that quote. Strong communities make police obsolete. Did I get that right? That's a great, I have to put that on Facebook or something. Very quotable. That's wonderful. All right, so let's take our first question. It's for Ms. V and Ms. Ayel. This person is asking, what does restorative justice and transformative justice mean in the context of dealing with someone who does cause harm? So you were talking about making prison systems obsolete, but this person is wondering about restorative justice and transformative justice for people who maybe do need something as a form of, I don't know if you want to call that punishment, restorative justice, if they actually have caused harm. Ms. Ayel, why don't you go first?
You know, like I said before, I am admittedly young in all this, but I think people tend to think of crime, especially violent crime, as something that has like a simple cause when they're incredibly complex. If if people who are dealing with substance use are, to are dealing with that kind of addiction, and then maybe rob somebody that with like a gun or something like that, and that is what people would consider a violent crime. But the root issue is not that the person was, evil trying to kill people. It's that they're dealing with addiction. And so it's not to say that like the person who was harmed doesn't have a right to some sort of accountability process. But what abolition is trying to point out is that if we take that person who in this scenario is robbing and then put them in prison or jail and then give them no access to treatment that would help them with their issue, what we did was, disappear the person for the time being who caused harm, but we didn't address the root cause of what drove them to commit a violent act, which is a substance use issue. So like we need to fund those kinds of things that, give people services and treatment to prevent future harm. But it's not to say that the person who was harmed does not, have the right to an accountability process, but prison and jail may not be the accountability process that actually eliminates crime or eliminates the future possibility of this happening. I'll kick it to Ms. B.
Can you repeat the question again? Because I have a few things I want to tell you.
Sure, no problem. So this person's basically asking about restorative justice. So if we make incarceration systems obsolete, what does restorative justice look like for people who actually do deserve or have caused harm or deserve some form of, I guess, punishment or something?
Just to jump in on that, what Miguel was saying, we definitely have to love our community. And sometimes that's tough love. And I used to do cognitive behavioral therapy in prisons and even for life. And so that's a form of working with someone through whatever issues they might have had or whatever concerns brought them into the criminal legal system. A lot of times people are guilty of what they're accused of, right? Of being convicted.
Sorry to cut you off, but you're saying stuff that's really, really important that people may not be hearing because for whatever reason your volume sounds kind of low. So repeat that.
Okay, so can you hear me now?
That's better.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe I should just talk louder. Okay. Sorry.
So
Okay.
you're starting with really important things that I want to make sure everyone gets.
So I used to do cognitive behavioral therapy in prisons and jails, even Rikers. And so I understand tough love. I understand what it means to hold the community accountable and still have to work with them through their concerns or what might have brought them to the criminal legal system. We can't run away from that issue. And so restorative justice to me is really acknowledging what needs to be addressed, addressing it with who it needs to be addressed with, honestly and non-judgmentally meeting them where they're at, accepting them as the individuals that they are, and actually giving them the tools to be a better and productive person, and then including them into the community upon their reentry. I can elaborate, but in a nutshell, that's the overview of what I would present restorative justice at in this conference.
Okay. Ash, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I just want to say, like, we think of ourselves as a really civilized society, and Miss V's pointed out the restorative justice puts the victim in the picture too. Our system is built to punish people, not actually care for the actual victim either. And again, going back to we're a civilized Western society, and what you see in other countries is transformative. I had the privilege of working in Sierra Leone for a project, and it was after the Civil War. And, a lot of child soldiers had to be put back into society, and they'd committed some horrific acts. Not because they wanted to, they were drugged up and told, sent off to war. And I saw healing that makes America look like a third world country. I saw people who had slaughtered other people's families and that family adopting that child into their community so they wouldn't lose another generation of Sierra Leoneans.
Wow.
We're not civilized when we think about our justices.
How do we get to that point? I mean, it seems like there's a lot of healing and a long process to get there.
Yeah, I mean, they went through a tragic war to get there. But, it shows who we care about. our justice system doesn't care about communities of colors, isn't afraid to lose a generation of us. And that's where this Black Lives Matter movement is important, because it shows that we should be cared about. Our lives do matter. If you did care about us, you wouldn't punish us the way you punish us. You wouldn't have police abducting people in Portland. You wouldn't have brutality the way you're seeing it on the streets. If our government structure cared for us, we would be more like Sierra Leone.
So I'll ask this question from Linda, who's kind of piggybacking on what you said, Ash, about what's happening in Portland right now. She just wants to get comments overall on the militarization of policing that we're seeing right now. So how do people respond to what they're seeing in Portland, and what should be done to stop that, prevent it? What should be done differently?
History is repeating itself, okay? What we're seeing in Portland, I remember standing and busing people down to Ferguson 5-6 years ago and telling people this is an injustice, and if we don't stop it now, we're going to see it again. And we are seeing it again. And as an Army brat, I take great offense to that, because my mother's in the military cemetery with so many other people who fought for the illusion of equity, justice, liberty for all, and it's not seen in this country. It's not felt in this country. And so I have a big problem with that, a major problem with that. And I feel like everyone on this panel and everyone who's listening, it's our duty to do what we can in our communities and even beyond, especially everything virtual now, to make serious and concrete change.
We've just let the Patriot Act get out of hand as well. Like, we put this act together after 9/11 when we were all scared, and we applauded it. Not necessarily people on this panel, but everyone in America is freaking out that people abroad are coming here to kill us, and didn't realize there were so many unchecked things there, like being able to abduct our own citizens, like we were abducting people from Middle Eastern descent in other countries and torturing them. Did we not think that was going to happen potentially, or unloaded on us with any unchecked nothing checked or balanced? And we kept renewing that Patriot Act, even under Democrat administrations. So our politicians have let all of us down, because this is the root, that Patriot Act, if you read it today, is the root to fascism. And we're seeing it play out right now in Portland, frankly in New York last night when they picked someone up off the street as well. And the police have got carte blanche to do that, because they wave that same thing, that this person is a threat to society, the same way they use that same phrase to describe terrorism.
Yeah.
Misael, go ahead.
Just quickly on the issue of militarization of police, like we are in a global pandemic. For in March, especially when New York was hit especially hard, 700-800 people dying every day. There were healthcare workers without masks, without PPE, like incarcerated people without masks, without PPE, like Kevin was saying. And we have riot gear. We have like every local police department with riot gear, with shields, with masks, with guns, with pepper spray, rubber bullets, all this. So how do we, it's about, reevaluating our values as a society. How do we have a budget and plan and method of execution to suppress people, literally kidnap people, and brutalize them, but we don't have a budget to protect healthcare workers who are trying to save us. We don't have a budget for PPE for essential workers who are trying to help our society in this moment. It makes absolutely no sense. Makes absolutely no sense.
Ms. V, did you want to add to that?
I want to say that many of the police officers and correction officers in our society are former are veterans. And many times, especially what you see in NYPD in the SRG unit, the Strategic Response Unit, is that many of those officers did many tours overseas in combat. And they come back and you see that they weren't properly debriefed from the military before they went into these law enforcement agencies with how they interact with us in the community in the street, the way they snatch us off. The speaker, Count Corey Johnson, tweeted about being disgusted about observing a video of a constituent being snatched off the street by secret police or however it was. But that's not something that just started. That's something that people are just now able to catch on film because more of us are out and about and conscious to have memory available to record. But that's not something that just started. And these are all things that we need to all as a community pay attention to and verbalize and let everyone else know hey, you think that abuse is just happening in your area of the country? No, it's happening over here in the woods too. And then mobilize and tear this entire system down.
So a question from Faye. How do you screen who is being hired to ensure detainees get the care they need? Maybe that one can go out to Ms. V, since you have worked in the system.
That's hard to really say, but I do know immediately when hearing the question, I know a couple years ago a report had went out and a study had been found to see how many actual correctional officers were affiliated with gang ties. And the report came back that showing that a certain amount of people, I don't want to misspeak, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but a certain amount of people weren't even properly investigated before being offered the job. And that's part of the problem. Because when we tell city council members, when we tell the Board of Corrections that organized crime goes on behind the walls, and many a times the things that occur is initiated because of an officer or by an officer, it gets overlooked. And I think that deeper investigation, actual accountability for those who are supposed to be performing the investigations is extremely important. And that's a great way to weed out. And then develop some type of program from people on the inside to tell you who's the big homies and stuff in the street. Because a lot of officers are directly connected to so many things that are against the law, so many things that they're supposed to be upholding and correcting people in corrections in their custody to be better than, that they are a part of themselves. I mean, during this pandemic, no visitors have been allowed, but drugs have still been coming into the system. So I think a deeper investigation is the solid answer to that question.
Okay. A question from Mary Rinaldi. There were a lot of people who mentioned things like turning closed hotels into quarantine housing or people who are released, galvanizing the community and other organizations to support people who are returning home. So Mary's question is, how do we force governments like New York City, New York State, to take those specific steps because of COVID? I'll open that up to anybody who wants to answer that one.
I mean, I'll have a go. I mean, we need to redefine what society looks like. I mean, we often use that dirty word, socialism. Like, I grew up in London, in the United Kingdom. We're technically a socialist government. We have free healthcare. We have free education. We have a lot of free things. Yet we're America's number one ally, and we still have a kind of capitalist country at the same time. Our government spends money. It's not perfect by any means, but it spends money on things we need. And our governments here need to start thinking about what they're about to see is a lot of reductions of their budget because we've had to spend a ton of money with COVID. So they have to think about how they spend it wisely. Again, it goes back to defunding the police, defunding the prison system, and when putting those dollars into social housing, into mental health practices, and into homeless shelters, frankly, all those things to take care of the people that they're supposed to represent. And it's up to us to make sure we vote them out. If they don't now, we need to be, this is our moment to make real systemic change. And, you know, if these officials right now aren't going to do that, then in New York specifically, the next elections next year, let's vote them out and make sure our budget is used to support our people, not institutions that are supposed to punish our people.
Okay, one last question. It's 1:30. I know we're supposed to be wrapping this up soon, but I wanted to get this one last question in here. Would it make a difference, and this is kind of an interesting question because I know there have been studies done about this, if police forces accurately represented the racial makeup of the community? There are some studies that show that that does make a difference and others that show that it doesn't. I'd like to get everybody's view on this. Why don't we start with you, Ash?
Everyone talks about the answer to this, and even the NYPD just released it, more community policing, more community policing. I will go back to it. I think it's something that hopefully all the panel will kind of agree with. I mean, more resources in the community. And then let's talk about how, if we need any police presence at all, you know, our community can police our people better than the police they can that operate right now. Look, if you are going to have some sort of police force, I'd rather they live and understand the people they police as well. Like, I'd rather they come from my apartment building or they come from my community, so they know everyone and they understand the issues. Look, it's not a science, but I would go down and invest in the root of sorting out those social issues so we don't even need them in the first place.
So regardless of the racial makeup, you think
We
Get rid
have
of
to put
police
our own
and-
community and get rid of it.
I
Oh, go ahead, Ms. Al.
just that, like, so about half of the NYPD force is people of color. And you know, it has made no difference in terms of police brutality. It really hasn't. And the leadership is overwhelmingly white. And as we've seen from the videos during recent protests, like police officers throwing up white power signs and things like that, like there's a huge issue of white supremacist ideology, potentially white supremacist leadership. So that doesn't matter if these are the people training how officers are supposed to interact with people, because you know, like all these things say back the blue. Blue is the color they're talking about. It's not us. It's not black or anything else. It's blue for a reason. So I personally think it makes a difference, though I would prefer someone from my community in the police while we still have police. But if training is by violent ideology, it doesn't matter what color you are, to me.
Okay. Ms. V?
I agree with Ms. Ayala and Ash. I totally agree that if we had to have police, making sure that they were from the community would assist in holding them accountable to the community. But at the same time, when we talk about police, or we even talk about DOC right here in New York City, they are predominantly Black and brown people who are put in place to oversee the incarcerated individuals. But it reminds me directly of white supremacy and the culture of enslavement. Slave masters had overseers on their plantation that represented my people, that still upheld what the slave master wanted, while people were forced to be abused and work in the fields and slave, you know, and just in inhumane conditions. And so that's exactly how I see the law enforcement and DOC in this city. And when you look at DOC's higher management from the commissioner on down, it's not really people of color at all. Over the last few years, the more and more that they've pulled away from actually communicating with us advocates and people on the advisory boards for adolescent and young adults, the higher ups have become more and more white, not even people of color, which could be brown rather than saying Black, but just white. And that concerns me, because when we go back to the white supremacy culture, we go back to not understanding how to completely change, and we go back to the 9 federal monitors, Nunes reports that have been coming out consistently for every 6 months since the lawsuit with the federal government, you know, against Rikers and the brutality consistently has not gotten better, but has only gotten worse. And you look at the management and the shifts, I don't believe that more Black people or brown people in a position of an agency that's ran underneath white supremacy ideology will be successful in change.
So Kevin, you had the first word when we started the conversation. I'll give you the last word as we end it. What do you think about that? Do you think having more people of color on police forces would make a positive difference? Oh, Kevin, you're muted. Can you unmute? Oh, there you go. There you go. I can hear you now. Yep.
Well, just like the other panelists stated, I don't think the color makes too much of a difference, because just like most of the panelists said, you have to really have people from the community there. But more so than that, the resources have to be put back in the community to help people achieve and to sustain themselves in the community. I'm a big advocate of putting the resources at the grassroots level that can help people sustain themselves. I mean, you can have diversity in the police department or in corrections, but just like Dr. V said, there's not going to be too much of a difference, because the mindset of what they are trained to believe to how to police over us or to correct us in corrections is not going to change, because they're still going to answer to that, you know, to that white supremacist theology. So we have to start by putting resources where they need to be, putting proper health care, housing, vocational training, those type of things will help alleviate some of the problems that are in the communities right now as we speak. We need better housing, we need better health care, we need better vocational training, job training. Those things are what really matter and will help, subside all of the things that are happening out in our communities. If the resources are put back into the grassroots level and back in place, I think you will see all of these problems subside. But when you put the resources into policing and to corrections, you're just going to have the same old thing happening over and over again. So I'm hopeful that somewhere along the line that might start happening sooner rather than later, before it's too late. I think that's really the answer, putting the resources where it really counts and really making it work, and not just having it there as just a, as just having it there just to say, oh God, they lost me.
Got it. Okay, putting the resources where they really work. That's a great statement to end this all on, I think. Thank you so much, Ash, Ms. V, Kevin, Ms. Ayel, for joining us today. Thanks to all the participants who've been watching and submitting their questions. Great questions, great discussion, and hopefully the discussion will continue on platforms like this and throughout the country until we come up with some real solutions here. Thanks, everybody.